At the core of Christianity lies the principle of non-acceptance of murder and violence. However, Russia has long been living in an Orwellian world, and after February 2022, this parallel reality has firmly established itself. From the church pulpits, it is proclaimed that war is peace, as paradoxical as it may sound. And one of the most fundamental Christian commandments, "Thou shalt not kill," has become unacceptable.
On October 19, 2023, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine approved a bill prohibiting religious organizations connected to an aggressor country. In Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate still operates, despite claiming its supposed independence from Moscow. The Russian Orthodox Church has become a significant instrument through which the idea of violence and aggression is disseminated to the masses. Today, we discuss the Russian Orthodox Church, which with each passing year increasingly resembles either a totalitarian sect, a well-organized business, or a government department where there is no room for spirituality.
Watch this!
In the late 10th century, Kiev Prince Volodymyr Sviatoslavich adopted Christianity following the Greek Rite and declared it the state religion of Kievan Rus. According to the primary chronicle, the baptism of Volodymyr and his retinue, which included the elite of Kiev, took place in 988 in Chersonesus. Afterward, the prince returned to Kiev, and at his command, the people of Kiev were baptized. It marked the establishment of the church organization in the region. Initially, Kievan Rus fell under the jurisdiction of Constantinople, where Christianity was embraced. Immediately after the baptism, the Kiev metropolis was established, and the first metropolitan, Michael, was appointed. Initially, the metropolitan's primary residence was in Pereyaslav, but after the construction of the St. Sophia Cathedral, it moved to Kiev. From that point on, Greeks who were sent from Constantinople during the entire pre-Mongol period led the church. An exception was Ilarion, the first metropolitan of Slavic origin. Despite this, due to the distance between Kievan Rus and Byzantium, the metropolitans enjoyed a fair degree of independence from the Patriarch of Constantinople in terms of internal governance. In the mid-12th century, Kievan Rus disintegrated into several independent principalities. The title Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus was added to the Metropolitan of Kiev. In 1240, Kiev was destroyed by the Mongols. Eastern Slavic principalities became part of the Mongol Empire, and as a result, regional princes and metropolitans traveled to the Horde and received the formal diplomas known as Yarlik. While Mongols often manipulated the regional princes, there were no recorded instances of metropolitans refusing to comply in the annals. The church was seen as an effective instrument of governance. As a result, within the largest empire in human history, different religions coexisted peacefully, including Buddhism, paganism, and various Christian denominations. During internal strife in the Golden Horde, the land of Kiev was devastated again, and in 1299 the see was moved to Volodymyr. A quarter of a century later, Moscow became the residence of the metropolitans. However, both in Volodymyr and Moscow, the head of the Russian Church continued to be referred to as the Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus, and formally remained under the jurisdiction of Constantinople. The result of the Mongol conquest was the loss of political significance by the Kievan state. The struggle for supremacy among the regional principalities led to the rise of Moscow, a relatively unknown and small city, which aimed to become the center for the unification of Eastern Slavic lands. Through wars and annexations for neighboring princes, Moscow expanded its controlled territory. The rulers of Moscow quickly realized the vital role the church could play in strengthening the state and governance. They began not only to support the church, but also to establish control over it, skillfully using it in political confrontations with other countries. However, for complete control, church independence from the Universal Patriarchate was needed.
Watch this.
With the rise and consolidation of Moscow's power, its confrontation with Constantinople began. The once mighty Byzantine Empire had become a small, weakened state constantly under attack by external enemies, primarily the Ottoman Turks. In search of financial and military support from Western countries, the Byzantine Emperor and part of the clergy agreed to a union with the Roman Church. It recognized the supremacy of the Pope in the Christian world, while Orthodox rituals and the Greek language in worship were preserved. Moscow took immediate advantage of this situation. In 1448, without the consent of the Universal Patriarch, the Church Council elected the Metropolitan of Kiev. After the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans, Moscow unilaterally declared the autocephaly of the Russian Orthodox Church. Subsequently, its leader was given the title of Metropolitan of Moscow, and the Kiev and Moscow thrones were separated. For 140 years, the Universal Patriarchs did not acknowledge the self-proclaimed autonomy of the Russian Orthodox Church. However, being under the rule of the Sultan and in need of financial aid from Moscow, they did not protest this fact. After the Ottoman expansion, the Moscow state remained the only sovereign Orthodox country. A pseudo-philosophical concept, Moscow the Third Rome, was devised. De jure, the Russian Orthodox Church remained part of the Constantinople Patriarchate. Still in Moscow, they aspired to a leading role in the global orthodoxy and sought complete independence for the Church. When in 1588 the Universal Patriarch Yeremiah II visited Moscow, Boris Godunov's government demanded the establishment of a Patriarchate. Lavish gifts did not help, and the head of the global orthodoxy stated that he needed help to decide such a vital matter unilaterally. Russia then resorted to threats, and the Patriarch effectively found himself under house arrest. Ultimately, through cunning and direct violence, Yeremiah was forced to agree to the demands. He recognized the right of the Russians to choose their church leader. There were no actual elections. The government specified who should be consecrated as Patriarch. It was a close associate of Godunov, Metropolitan job. In a decree in the Royal Chancellery, it was stated that all the Eastern Patriarchs agreed to establish the Patriarchate in Moscow, which was an outright falsehood. It caused an adverse reaction in the Orthodox East. Many theologians and bishops objected to the unilateral decision of the head of the Universal Church. However, to confirm this decision, the consent of the heads of all Orthodox churches and their bishops was required. For this purpose, a council was convened in Constantinople. After the council, a decree permitting the establishment of the Patriarchate in Moscow was delivered. In the late 20th century, handwriting analysis of the decree revealed that the majority of the signatures on it, at least 70 out of 105, were forged. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the choice of the Moscow Patriarch was solely at the discretion and will of other ruler, and the Church Council only confirmed it. In 1700,000, Peter the Great prohibited the election of the Patriarch. He established a spiritual ministry named the Holy Synod by placing the Church's administrative bodies under state control, with the de facto head of the Church being the Emperor.
Watch this.
Furthermore, after the Moscow affair with the establishment of the Patriarchate, the Kiev metropolis remained subordinate to the Universal Patriarchate of Constantinople. In 1654, in Pereyaslav, Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky and the Cossack leadership concluded an agreement with the Moscow government. Despite its consent, this began Ukraine's incorporation into the Moscow Tsardom. Such a significant change in political life could not avoid affecting the Kiev metropolis. The 1654 agreement did not envisage a change in its canonical status, and Ukrainian clergy were guaranteed the preservation of their rights. But everything changed shortly after the death of Bogdan Khmelnytsky. Just 4 years after the Pereyaslav Council, Khmelnytsky's son Yuri was compelled to sign a new agreement. It included an article stating that Kiev Metropolitan and other bishops must receive blessings from the Moscow Patriarch. From then on, both the secular and religious authorities in the Kremlin became increasingly involved in Ukraine's church life. The first attempt to install a metropolitan in Kiev directly from Moscow failed, as Constantinople did not grant permission. However, in 1685, the elected Metropolitan Gedon of Kiev went to swear allegiance to the Moscow Patriarch, not the Universal Patriarch. The following year, a Moscow delegation traveled to Constantinople to negotiate to complete transfer of the Kiev metropolis under the jurisdiction. After lengthy negotiations with Patriarch Dionysius IV and the Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, an episcopal council convened in June 1686 to make the final decision. The right to appoint the Metropolitan in Kiev was given to the Moscow Patriarch. The hierarchy of the council received substantial gifts, which in contemporary terms could be called bribes, for their decision. Kiev remained an eparchy of the Constantinople Patriarchate. It was because Orthodoxy has a diptych, a list of the head of all autocephalous Orthodox churches. Their commemoration during the liturgy is obligatory in all churches. The fact that the Kiev Metropolitan was required to mention the name of the Constantinople Patriarch first during the liturgy indicates that the Universal Patriarchy continued to regard Kiev as its canonical territory. In other words, this was only about granting permission to ordain the Metropolitan of Kiev, not about a complete jurisdictional transfer. The next council, 11 years later, saw Patriarch Dionysius being condemned for transferring the Kiev metropolis to Moscow for a bribe and was subsequently removed from his throne. Moscow promptly violated the terms of the agreement. The election of the Kiev Metropolitan was transferred to the Russian Synod, the mention of the Universal Patriarch during the liturgy ceased, and the Metropolitan's privileges were revoked. Soon after, the metropolis ceased to exist as an independent church unit. After Peter the Great's church reform, the election of the Metropolitan was discontinued, and the emperor began confirming candidates from a few suggested ones. From 1730 onwards, the head of the Kiev Metropolitan was no longer called a Metropolitan but an Archbishop. From that time, it essentially ceased to exist as a separate church unit within the Russian Church.
Watch this!
Bringing the Russian Orthodox Church under state control and depriving it of its autonomy, Peter the Great made it a complaint tool of secular authority, meant to serve its political interests. In the first legislative act of Emperor Paul I, he was explicitly referred to as the head of the Church. The Russian Orthodox Church was transformed into a mere department and became a branch of the bureaucratic apparatus, with priests effectively becoming state officials who received salaries. The Church defended autocratic rule, powerlessness, and violence in Russian life, while opposing progressive thought and freedom. Leaders of liberation movements were declared enemies of the state by direct orders from secular authorities and were subjected to anathema. For example, without canonical basis, Ukrainian headman Mazepa was placed under anathema. With its spiritual authority, the Church sanctioned executions and threw reactionary sermons from its pulpits, incited one segment of the population against another. By order for the authorities, priests were required to report what they had learned during confessions. In return, the Russian Orthodox Church became a state institution. In a multi-confessional country like the Russian Empire, the Orthodox clergy received a privileged position. The Orthodox Church had its court, material wealth, and with state assistance suppressed dissenting voices and representatives of other religious denominations. The Church controlled primary education throughout the empire and had a colossal influence on cultural life. After the February Revolution of 1917 and the overthrow of autocracy in Russia, the participate was reinstated. Patriarch Tikhon became the sole head of the Russian Orthodox Church, elected without the influence of secular authorities. However, this was short-lived, as the Bolsheviks seized power and launched a campaign against religion. Atheism became a central element of their ideology and was actively promoted until the final years of the Soviet system. One of the first Bolshevik decrees was separating the church from the state, depriving schools of legal status and property ownership, and confiscating valuables, precious metals, precious stones, and religious artifacts under the pretext of famine relief. As part of their anti-religious campaign in January 1918, the Bolsheviks even organized a people's tribunal against God, charging him with crimes against humanity and mass genocide. All procedural formalities were observed. Judges, prosecutors, witnesses, and defense attorneys were present, with an audience in the courtroom. The Bible was placed on the defendant's bench, and a lengthy trial took place, concluding with a death sentence read by the chairman, Anatoly Lunacharsky, the first People's Commissar of Enlightenment. The following day, a firing squad executed God, symbolically firing shots into the sky over Moscow. In the 1930s, there was a surge of repression against the clergy. Churches were systematically closed. Priests were accused of counter-revolutionary conspiracies, sent to labor camps, and executed. During the Stalinist era, most of the top hierarchs of the Russian Orthodox Church perished. Confessional cemeteries were destroyed, and monuments were dismantled. However, despite the harsh anti-religious campaign, most Soviet people remained believers. World War II prompted the Soviet government to change its religious policy, as Nazi Germany actively utilized churches in the occupied territories, and the Soviet Union found itself an unexpected alliance with Western allies. Consequently, the Soviet government decided to seize the complete eradication of religion and adopted a policy of partial revival of church life under strict state control.
Watch this!
The change in policy toward the church was prompted by the liberation of Ukraine from the Nazis. A religious revival took place in the territory during the years of occupation. In September 1943, Stalin met with 3 surviving hierarchs who had endured years of terror. He allowed for the election of a patriarch, the reopening of religious institutions, and the release of imprisoned archbishops. However, when a list of 26 bishops in detention was presented, it was revealed that only one of them had not been executed. The Soviet authorities, like the former Tsarist regime, understood that through church institutions they could control the minds and sentiments of the broad masses of the population. Since then, the Russian Orthodox Church has become a loyal servant of the regime. Additionally, Stalin recognized the importance of the Church in strengthening the international position of the USSR. He wanted to transform the Russian Orthodox Church into the center of world orthodoxy, intending to control it and make it serve Moscow's political interests. For this purpose, it was decided to convene a council in Moscow to elect a new ecumenical patriarch. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Alexius I, was meant to assume this role. The status of the Patriarch of Constantinople was planned to be diminished. However, Moscow faced disappointment, as Ecumenical Patriarch Maximus V had no intention of renouncing his prerogatives or yielding them to the Russian Church. Under the influence of the USSR, the Turkish government forced the Patriarch to resign. Moreover, several heads of local churches stated that they would not attend the Soviet Union, and the council could not be held under the pressure of secular authorities. As a result, instead of the Council, an All-Orthodox Conference was convened in Moscow in 1948. The ambitious plans of the Kremlin were not realized, and a new wave of persecution against the Russian Orthodox Church began immediately after this. It peaked during Khrushchev's rule when he publicly promised to show the last priests on television. To control the Orthodox clergy, the Soviet government established the Council for Religious Affairs of the Russian Orthodox Church, led by the Secretary General Georgy Karpov. Karpov had recently been an active participant in Stalin's repressions, conducting mass arrests, interrogations, and falsifying interrogation records. Now he was placed in charge of the church. Officially, it was declared that state authorities did not interfere in the affairs of religious organizations. In reality, the Council granted permission to open new churches and monasteries, and it was responsible for the material support of priests. The Council controlled all church governance bodies, including the Synod. Subsequent leaders of the Council for Religious Affairs, as well as its rank-and-file employees, were also security service workers. Therefore, all significant decisions made within the Russian Orthodox Church were approved and coordinated within the government and the KGB. The government directly controlled the elections of subsequent patriarchs, and their candidacies were approved in the Kremlin. In practice, during the reign of Alexius I and his successor Pimen, the head of the Council for Religious Affairs, not the Patriarch, made all significant decisions. However, until the Gorbachev era, the Soviet regime alternately reconciled with and fought against the Russian Orthodox Church. Churches continued to be closed, anti-religious propaganda persisted, and religious holidays were banned.
Watch this!
Only in 1988, after the widely celebrated 1000th anniversary of the baptism of Rus, did the government change its attitude towards the Church, allowing it to escape from the control of state authorities temporarily. However, this freedom did not last long. After a period of relatively free existence in the 1990s and the establishment of Vladimir Putin's authoritarian regime, the Russian Orthodox Church once again became subservient to secular authority, obediently following its directives in exchange for privileges and economic benefits. A glimpse at the luxury cars parked near the Christ the Savior Cathedral in Moscow gives no impression that they belong to monks. Or consider the notorious incident with the outrageously expensive wristwatches worn by Patriarch Kirill, which appeared in a reflection on a table despite not being on his wrist. Today's Russian Orthodox Church is a highly successful business. Every parish is required to send financial contributions to Moscow. Church utensils, furniture, icons, and candles are produced at the Sofrina plant near Moscow, and all Russian dioceses are obliged to procure from it. The church's business interests include hotels, buildings, printing houses, small factories, and agriculture farms. Additionally, there are unregistered and uncounted donations. The church also receives financial support from the government through various special programs amounting to billions of rubles. However, the Putin regime does not engage in charity. The Russian Orthodox Church is expected to contribute to the regime's stability both domestically and internationally. Similar to the Soviet government, the current regime actively uses the Russian Orthodox Church to advance its political interests in the West, mainly where the Russian Orthodox diaspora resides. Large sums of money are spent on constructing Russian churches, even if they remain largely empty and only fill up on Easter and Christmas. For instance, in the center of Paris, very close to the Eiffel Tower, golden Orthodox domes appeared in 2016. The construction of a Russian cultural central and cathedral on the Seine caused a significant stir in the French press and among art historians. It is evident that through the construction of new churches and the sending of Orthodox priests, The battle for the sentiments of parishioners is being waged. In the spring of 2023, several Orthodox parishes in the United States received warnings from the FBI that Russian intelligence agencies were conducting covert activities among priests and parishioners. One of the priests sent from Moscow was suspected of being a professional intelligence agent. After the ensuing scandal, he was quietly dismissed from the Russian Orthodox Church. Cooperation between intelligence services and the Church is not unusual. Both parties share a paranoid belief that Russia is surrounded by numerous enemies and constantly under threat from the West.
Watch this.
With the onset of the war against Ukraine, the Russian Orthodox Church saw an opportunity to create an entire fundamentalist regime within the country. In 2010, priests were granted access to the military, leading to the establishment of military priests of Champlains. The war elevated the Church's presence to a new level. The specter of defeat unsettled the army, and social media became flooded with icons, prayers for victory, and calls to pray for soldiers on the battlefield. The religious mysticism reflected the growing need of the military for spiritual guidance in unfamiliar war. The Church supported this, and with its blessing, Russian battalions started adopting the names of Russian saints, particularly various like Prince Alexander Nevsky, who was canonized for his victories over the Crusaders. The Church also produced prominent clerics from within its ranks who pitched total war, such as Andrei Tkachov, a Ukrainian-born priest and television presenter who left Ukraine in 2014 to become one of the most aggressive pro-war voices within the Russian Orthodox Church. Since the beginning of the conflict, his YouTube videos gained immense popularity among army units, including special forces. From the very start of the war, the Russian Orthodox Church has been fully supportive of the Russian army's actions in Ukraine. It appears as if the old imperial slogan for faith and fatherland has returned. Regardless of the nature of the war, the Church supports it. But this time it is not about the Tsars, it is about Putin, and the Russian Orthodox Church has tied its future to the survival of the Putin regime. Russian priests bless those who go to kill peaceful Ukrainians, encourage believers to support the occupation, and ideologically justify the invasion. In October 2023, the Security Service of Ukraine exposed the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church in the creation of private military companies with Russia. These companies are involved in recruiting and training mercenaries for the war against Ukraine. The Church shares responsibility for the war in Ukraine by cooperating with the government in aggression. Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew publicly made this statement. In Moscow, they could not reconcile themselves with the granting of autocephaly to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Patriarch Kirill, who publicly approves of the war and the killing of Ukrainians, has gone so far as to claim that nuclear weapons were created with the divine purpose under the protection of Saint Sergius of Rhodanus, one of the most revered saints. The term atomic orthodoxy, which previously seemed like a joke and a meme, is taking on real traits. Even Putin himself often employs religious political rhetoric, talking about the sacred significance of Crimea and the subversion of faith in the West. Outside of Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church has closely followed Moscow's line. The overseas church, for the most part, remains loyal. For instance, Archbishop Gabriel of Montreal and Canada openly justified the invasion. In London, Bishop Irenei, the head of the Diocese of Great Britain and Western Europe and the most influential bishop of the overseas church, published a message titled "On the Persecution of Christians in Ukraine," referring to the activities of Ukrainian authorities rather than the Russian army. Notably, these two high-ranking clergymen are not Moscow-appointed commissars. They were born and raised in the West.
Watch this.
The Russian Orthodox Church has been known to emphasize the belief that all authority comes from God. In the Soviet Union, it was often referred to as state-controlled orthodoxy. This perception remains under the current regime. Interestingly, many Russians combine their belief in God with belief in spirits, shamans, and psychics. The Russian Orthodox Church will continue to support the government, even if it means disregarding some of the tenets of the Christian faith. So, who does the Russian Orthodox Church serve today? Putin or God? The answer seems quite clear. To be continued.